On a winter evening in 1931, the telephone rang in a Liverpool chess club. The caller asked for one of the members by name, a quiet, middle-aged insurance agent named William Herbert Wallace. Wallace had not yet arrived, so the caller left a message. Would Mr. Wallace come, the following evening, to discuss an insurance policy at an address on the other side of the city, 25 Menlove Gardens East? The next night, Wallace went. He crossed Liverpool by tram to find the address, and he could not find it. He asked a policeman. He asked a tram conductor. He asked people on the street. He checked a directory. He spent well over an hour searching, because the address he had been sent to did not exist. There was a Menlove Gardens North, a South, and a West, but there was no Menlove Gardens East. There never had been. And while William Wallace was wandering the far side of Liverpool, knocking on the wrong doors, asking strangers for a street that was not on any map, his wife, Julia, was being beaten to death in the front parlor of their own home. Wallace was arrested. Wallace was tried. Wallace was convicted and sentenced to hang. And then the appeal court did something it had never done in the whole history of English law before that day. This is a case that has been called, by people who spent their lives with murders, the most perfect and the most impossible ever recorded. And in more than 90 years, nobody has ever solved it. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if forgotten stories like this one are the reason you're here, subscribe. This is all we do. This is the Wallace case. William Herbert Wallace was by any measure an unlikely figure to stand at the center of a national sensation. He was in his early 50s, a collector for the Prudential Assurance Company, the man who walked a set round of Liverpool streets week after week, knocking on doors and taking in small insurance payments from working families. It was modest, respectable, unglamorous work, but Wallace himself was not a simple man. He was a quiet intellectual. He read philosophy and science. He played the violin. He conducted small chemistry experiments. And above all, he played chess, seriously, at a club that met at a cafe in the city center. He was thin, precise, controlled, and a little cold in manner, the kind of man people found hard to read. His wife, Julia, was older than she admitted, and older than most people around them realized. The couple had been married for many years, and they lived, without children, in a small terraced house at 29 Wolverton Street, in the Anfield district of Liverpool. Their life together was quiet and inward and settled. They shared music and books and each other's company, and by every account, they were a devoted, undemonstrative, aging couple who kept themselves largely to themselves. There was nothing about them, nothing at all, that suggested either of them would ever appear in a newspaper. And that is part of what made what happened so frightening. On the evening of Monday, the 19th of January, 1931, Wallace's chess club was due to meet at the city cafe, and shortly before he arrived, the telephone there rang. The man on the line gave his name as R.M. Qualtrough. He asked for Wallace, was told Wallace had not yet come in, and left a careful message with a club official. He wanted Mr. Wallace to call on him the following evening, at 7:30, on a matter of insurance business, something to do with a policy for his daughter, who was coming of age. He gave the address as 25 Menlove Gardens East, and then he rang off. When Wallace arrived a little later, the message was passed to him. He did not recognize the name Qualtrough. He did not recognize the address. But an insurance agent lived on commission, and a new customer with a policy to arrange was not something a careful man turned down. He wrote the details in his notebook. He would go the next evening, after work. There is one detail about that phone call that would come to matter more than almost anything else in the case. It was later established that the call had been placed from a public telephone box, and that the telephone box stood only a few hundred yards from Wallace's own home, on the route he would have walked to reach the chess club that very night. The following evening, Tuesday the 20th of January, William Wallace set out to keep his appointment with Mr. Qualtrough. He took a tram across the city toward the Menlove Gardens district, a genteel suburban area he did not know, and when he got there, he could not find the address. He found Menlove Gardens North. He found Menlove Gardens South. He found Menlove Gardens West. There was no Menlove Gardens East. So Wallace did what a conscientious man does. He asked. He stopped a police constable and asked the way. He asked a passing tram conductor. He asked residents. He went into a shop and consulted a street directory. He knocked on number 25 of one of the streets that did exist and was told no Qualtro lived there. For well over an hour, William Wallace made himself as visible and as memorable as it is possible for a man to be, asking a dozen strangers in a dozen places for an address that was not real. And then, defeated, he gave up and began the long journey home. Everything about that hour would later be examined with enormous care, because depending on how you looked at it, it was either the perfectly innocent behavior of a man on a wasted errand, or the most cold-blooded alibi ever constructed. Wallace reached his own street at around 8:45 that evening, and he could not get into his own house. He tried the front door. It seemed to be bolted. He went round to the back. That door, too, would not open for him. He tried the front again. Nothing. He was, by his account, on the point of giving up and going to a neighbor when the couple who lived next door, the Johnstons, came out of their own back door on their way out for the evening. Wallace spoke to them. He said he could not get in and that he was worried, and with the two of them standing there as witnesses, he tried the back door one more time, and this time it opened. He went inside, into the dark house, calling his wife's name, and in the front parlor, the room they used for guests and for music, he found Julia. She had been beaten to death. A cabinet in the room had been broken into. A small cash box that held the insurance money Wallace collected on his round had been rifled, and a few pounds were gone. But it was a strange, half-hearted robbery. Larger sums of money elsewhere in the house had been left completely untouched. Whatever had happened in that parlor, the handful of pounds taken from the cash box did not begin to explain it. From the moment the police arrived, the case turned on one thing above all others: time. A boy delivering milk had seen Julia Wallace alive, and well, at the front door of the house early that evening. The accounts put it at somewhere around 6:30. And William Wallace had been seen boarding a tram, some distance from his home, a very short while later, by most reckonings, a little after 7. Between those two fixed points lay a window so narrow that it became the whole battleground of the case. Because to be guilty, Wallace would have had to do all of this inside that window, kill his wife in a sustained and brutal attack, in the parlor, and then somehow clean every trace of it from himself, and then walk out, calm and unmarked, to catch his tram and begin his elaborate hunt across the city for a man who did not exist. And there was the problem that hung over the whole prosecution. The attack had been savage. Whoever did it would have been marked by it. Yet when Wallace was seen that evening, and when he was examined afterwards, there was no blood on him. To believe he was guilty, you had to believe that a 52-year-old insurance clerk had committed a ferocious murder and then cleaned himself spotless in a few short minutes in a cold house and walked out into the night without a trace on him, perhaps, the prosecution suggested, wearing nothing but a raincoat while he did it, which he then disposed of. It was possible. It was just barely, arguably possible, but it asked a great deal. And this is the thing that makes the Wallace case what it is. There are only two explanations, and both of them are almost impossible to believe. The first is that Wallace did it, that he was a cold, controlled, meticulous man in an aging marriage who conceived of a nearly perfect crime, that he himself made the Qualtro call from a phone box near his own home, disguising his voice, inventing a customer and an appointment, so that the following night he would have a reason to be seen all over the far side of the city while his wife lay dead. That the whole wandering, door-knocking search was theater performed for witnesses. It is a chilling theory, but it requires the impossibly tight timeline and the spotless cleanup, and it requires us to believe this quiet man was capable of a plan of almost inhuman calculation. The second explanation is that Wallace was exactly what he appeared to be, an innocent man, and that someone else made that call, someone who knew Wallace, someone who knew his chess knight, and knew he would get the message, and knew that a man like Wallace would dutifully go chasing an insurance commission across town. Someone who knew the house, and knew about the cash box, and used the false appointment to guarantee that Julia would be alone. On this theory, the Qualtrough call was not an alibi, it was a lure, a way of emptying the house of the one person who might have been in the killer's way. Two explanations. One of them is true, and nearly a century of people, cleverer than any of us, have failed to prove which. The police settled on the first explanation. They arrested William Herbert Wallace and charged him with the murder of his wife. The trial opened at the Liverpool Assizes in the spring of 1931, and the case the prosecution put forward was, from beginning to end, entirely circumstantial. There was no confession. There was no witness to the crime. There was no murder weapon conclusively tied to Wallace's hand. There was no blood on him, no clear motive beyond vague suggestion, and a timeline that its own supporters admitted was desperately tight. What there was, instead, was a story. The story of the phone call, the false address, the convenient errand, and the strange calm of the man at the center of it. The prosecution asked the jury to look at that pattern and see design. The defense pointed to everything the story could not explain: the absence of blood, the impossibility of the cleanup, the missing money that no husband would need to steal from himself, and above all, the sheer, staggering coldness the theory required of a man with no history of violence of any kind. The jury retired, and they came back with a verdict of guilty. William Wallace was sentenced to death. There are moments when the law itself has to decide what kind of thing it is. Wallace's appeal was one of them. His case went up to the Court of Criminal Appeal, and the judges there did something without precedent in English legal history. Up to that point, an appeal court could overturn a conviction for an error of law, a mistake by the judge, a misdirection to the jury, some flaw in the process. What it had never done was overturn a jury's verdict simply on the ground that the evidence was not strong enough to support it, that a reasonable jury, looking honestly at the facts, could not properly have been sure. To do that was to reach into the sacred space of the jury's decision and say, "You were wrong." And that is exactly what they did. The court held that the case against William Wallace was not proved to the standard the law required, that the verdict could not be supported having regard to the evidence, and it quashed the conviction outright. Wallace did not get a retrial. He was simply free. It was the first time an English court had ever set aside a murder conviction on those grounds, and it remains one of the most significant rulings in the history of English criminal justice. A quiet insurance man from Anfield had walked, unknowing, into legal history. He left the court an innocent man in the eyes of the law. But the law is one thing, and the world is another. Being acquitted did not give William Wallace his life back. Nothing could. His employers took him back, but they could not send him out on his rounds any longer. No household in Liverpool wanted the man half the city still believed had murdered his wife knocking at their door to collect the insurance. He was moved to a desk, kept out of sight. His neighbors shunned him. He was pointed at in the street. He had been legally cleared and socially convicted, and he lived in the space between those two things, which is one of the loneliest places a person can be. He did not have long to endure it. Wallace had suffered for years from a serious kidney condition, and in the strain of everything that had happened, his health gave way. He died in early 1933, a little over 2 years after Julia. He went to his grave insisting, quietly and consistently, that he had not killed his wife, and that whoever had was still out there, unpunished, having got away with the perfect crime. Whether that was the protest of an innocent man or the last performance of a guilty one is, of course, the very question the case can never answer. But Wallace's belief that the real killer was still out there was not baseless. because from early on, there was another name in the story. There was a young man who had once worked as a prudential agent himself, who knew Wallace, who knew the Wallace's home, and who knew the one thing a stranger could not have known: how and where the insurance money was kept. He was, by various accounts, in financial difficulty, willing to bend the rules, and known to Wallace as exactly the sort of person who might have both the knowledge and the nerve. He had, it was later argued, a connection to the very cash arrangements that the half-hearted robbery had targeted. And questions were raised about how solid his account of his own movements really was on the night of the murder. Decades later, researchers who went back over the case built a detailed argument that this man, perhaps with an accomplice, had made the Qualtro call and committed the crime, using the false appointment to draw Wallace away and empty the house. It is a genuinely persuasive theory. It fits the facts that the case against Wallace never could: the intimate knowledge of the household, the targeting of the cash box, the point of the lure. But it was never tested in a court, and it never can be. The man in question lived out his life and died decades later, having never been charged with anything. Persuasive is not the same as proven, and so he too remains, forever, a suspect and not a killer. The Wallace case has never gone away, because it cannot be resolved, and the human mind cannot let go of a thing it cannot resolve. The great crime writers were drawn to it like moths. Raymond Chandler, who knew something about impossible murders, called it unbeatable, a case where every explanation collapses the moment you lean on it. Dorothy Sayers wrote about it. Novelists and lawyers and detectives have circled it for decades, each certain they have finally seen the answer, and each, in the end, left holding the same two explanations that cancel each other out. If Wallace was guilty, the crime is almost superhumanly cold and clever. If Wallace was innocent, the crime is almost superhumanly cold and clever, only committed by someone else. The horror does not go away, it just changes hands. And underneath the puzzle, as always, there is the thing the puzzle is made of. There was a woman named Julia, older than she let anyone know, who had spent her quiet years with books and music and a difficult, undemonstrative husband in a small house on a small street. On an ordinary Tuesday evening, a telephone rang somewhere across the city and set something in motion, and a few hours later, she was dead in the room where she used to play. The call that killed her was answered by a stranger's voice, giving a name that was not real, arranging a meeting that could not happen, at an address that was never there. Somebody made that call. Somebody knew exactly what it would do, and whoever it was, the husband or the other man or someone whose name we have never even learned, took the answer with them and left the rest of us with a phone box, a false address, and a question that will almost certainly never be closed. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe cases like this one deserve to be remembered, subscribe. The next one is already coming.